So as you remember, for the last few weeks, we've been focused on trying to understand the problem of evil and its consequences. So today I chose a reading from Paul's letter to the Ephesians, which shows both Paul's theory of evil and also the fact that he's very definitely a person of his times. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly, as if you were serving the Lord, not people, because you know that the Lord will reward each one for whatever good they do, whether they are slave or free. And masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Words inspired by God. Both of my parents were prodigious readers all of their lives, right up to the end. And probably one of the gifts they ever gave to us as the kids was to make sure we took out membership in the library, the city library in Cork City. And there was a children's section. And I devoured particularly all of the boy books at that stage. And two of my favorite writers were two Scottish writers, Robert Louis Stevenson and his wonderful novels, Treasure Island, stuff like that. And the other was called R.M. Ballantyne. And one of his books was called The Coral Island. And it's a story of three young boys who were shipwrecked on an uninhabited island that's visited occasionally, sometimes by pirates, and sometimes by cannibals, and sometimes by Christian missionaries. And the story of how three well-educated Christian boys behave when they're surrounded with this kind of situation. Pirates who come to raid, cannibals who come to eat, and Christian missionaries who come to convert. And of course, being good Christian boys, well-educated, and European, they managed finally to help convert all of the cannibals to Christianity. And there's a great scene in which one of the dying pirates finally confesses his sins and is reconciled with the Lord Jesus. That was written way back in 1857. Almost 100 years later, an English writer this time called William Golding, who had read Ballantyne's work, and he asked his wife, do you really think that this is how boys left to their own devices, would behave, or would they behave very differently? And so he wrote another book called Lord of the Flies in 1954, almost 100 years after Ballantyne had written his. And his story is very, very different. It's a whole group of boys who are shipwrecked. And it's interesting, the two main characters have the same names as the two main characters in The Coral Island by Ballantyne, Ralph and Jack. But in this case, these boys, very, very quickly, the whole group disintegrates into a primitive state where they're actually killing each other. Now, the novel itself is about looking at the difference between groupthink, when everybody is forced to think in the one way, versus individual thinking. Looking at the difference between rationality and emotionality, and looking at the difference between morality and immorality. So when you think about left to our own devices, how any group of people, even young children, how they might behave in the absence of some kind of civilizing authority, how would they behave? Would they become Christian missionaries, or would they become barbarians who are killing their own? And that's the topic that I've tried to look at over the last 3 weeks, and I want to recap today. I want to look at the whole issue of the problem of evil, Theodicy, and I've devoted 3 homilies to it, and today I'll do a recap and then have a Q&A afterwards. So the problem of evil, what theologians call theodicy, is the most vexatious problem humans have ever wrestled with in the course of our history. There have been attempts by theologians, by sociologists, by psychologists, by philosophers, and by scientists to understand this phenomenon. And I looked over the course of the homilies at some previous attempts, to explain this phenomenon. I looked at the book of Genesis, the story of Adam and Eve and their disobedience. I looked at the book of Job. I looked at Jesus' teaching that evil comes from demons and from what he calls the world. I looked at Paul's teaching that it comes from the flesh, the law, the world, and evil spirits. And I looked at Augustine's theory of original sin, that all evil comes because of the irrationality of an orgasm during coupling, when a man and a woman are making love and they're totally out of control, and it's at that moment that the baby is conceived, and therefore is conceived in original sin. So I looked at all of these various attempts to explain it. And then I focused on trying to come up with a theory of my own that might explain the idea of evil. And I give you my own definition, that for me, when I think of evil, I think evil is a kind of an energy which is born and nurtured when beings who have free will continually make choices for selfishness. For me, that would be my definition of evil. That is, it's an energy which is born and is nurtured when beings who have free will continually make choices for selfishness. So that's kind of my starting place. So today, as I do a recap, I'm going to make 4 main points and then open it up. Firstly, I'm going to examine what I consider to be the sources of evil. And I'm going to make the claim that there are 8 different sources of evil. Secondly, I look at the results of evil, and I will just focus on 2 results: war and slavery. Thirdly, I'm going to look at what I call simplistic analyses and pseudo-solutions to the problem of evil. And then fourthly, coming fully awake. What does it mean to live in a world, such as we live in, and still find the light? So that's the recap I'll do very, very quickly this morning. So I've made the claim over the 3 homilies that there are basically 8 different sources of evil in our world. And the first one I would call our relationship with the gods. That's one source of our understanding of evil in the world. The notion of sin and culpability. And I suggested that the notion of sin has gone through 3 phases. That the first phase was the breach of a taboo. That people who accidentally have encounters with the divine, and if they're not prepared for it, they either go mad or they get inflated. And so the elders put a kind of a fence around the Torah, put a fence around having these mystical experiences without being trained for it, so that you don't either go mad because you can no longer live in the real world, or you get so totally inflated that you think that you and only you are God. That, I believe, was the first notion of sin. The second notion of sin, I believe, was the breach of a covenant. Particular tribes made particular covenants with particular gods. And when the group broke that covenant, that was the second iteration of the notion of sin. The third one was lists of commandments breaking individual precepts. And the first great listing came about 2100 BCE with the Code of Ur-Nammu in Mesopotamia. And then in 1776 BCE, also in Mesopotamia, the better known Code of Hammurabi. And then about 1250 BC, the Mosaic Code, the 613 precepts of Torah from Moses. So breaking an individual commandment was the third kind of iteration of sin. And that led to the notion of culpability. And I traced for you my understanding of how culpability changes throughout the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. That the first notion of culpability is what I call passing the apple. Adam and Eve sinned, and none of them would take responsibility. Adam blamed his wife blamed the serpent, and the serpent blamed God for creating him. So the first stage of culpability is passing the apple. The second one is the corporate singularity. Everybody is guilty for the sin of the first parents in perpetuity. That was the second level. Thirdly, the notion of the scapegoat, that you could take the sins of the whole group, impose it onto a goat, and send the goat off into the desert, as Moses did every year. And that's the scapegoat, that one person takes responsibility for the sins of the whole group. The next iteration was that God would only punish the sins to the 3rd and 4th generation, and then he'd let go. The fifth one was Jeremiah and Ezekiel around the year 600 and 550 BCE saying that, no, only the person who sins will be held responsible. But Jesus took it 2 stages further. Jesus saying that those who create bad laws and bind heavy loads and put them on people's shoulders are responsible for the breaches of the law subsequently by people who can't hold that weight. And then finally, the final response to culpability was Jesus dedicating his life to healing the sin of the world by his compassion and his love. So that for me is the first source of evil, our relationship with the gods and the notion of sin and culpability. The second origin of evil, I believe, is the notion of emergence. And emergence is where the total is greater than the sum of the parts, that you could not predict the outcome from the constituent elements that went into making it up. So for instance, for billions of years, hydrogen and oxygen existed in our universe independently of each other, but they had never gotten together. When they did get together and you got H2O, you had water, a phenomenon that could not have been predicted from just examining the 2 discrete separate elements. So in that sense, I believe evil is an emergent phenomenon. It was not created by God and tossed into the crucible of incarnation to test us. It emerges because of our own behavior. And I gave a few kind of simple metaphors. When you buy a jigsaw puzzle and you tumble all the pieces onto the table, and you start working on it, looking at the corner pieces and the straight edges, and then the colors and the contours and the picture on the box, you should be able to create what's on the cover of the box. But if you wind up with a jigsaw puzzle that is lumpy and has gaps in it and pieces left over, it's not because that was a possibility, in the sense that the person who designed this jigsaw said, there's 2 ways of doing this jigsaw puzzle. You can do it really, really badly and have a lumpy, whole one, or you can have a perfect one. In other words, the bad jigsaw puzzle was an emergent phenomenon because of the way in which you constructed it, not because it pre-existed. I give you the example of watching cows and snakes in Africa come to the same water hole, drinking the same water. And the cow would turn the water into milk to feed her young, and the snake would turn the water into venom to kill her prey. And in the same way, it is not the experiences we have as human beings that are evil. It is how we process them. What we do with the experiences of incarnation determines whether or not we're moving into the darkness or into the light. And I give the example of this great poem, The Touch of the Master's Hand, about an old dirty violin which has been auctioned, and he's been offered $2 or $3 for it, until an old man comes up from the back of the auditorium and looks at it, cleans it, and begins playing it. And all of a sudden, when the bidding begins again, he's offered $2,000, $3,000. And somebody asks, what made the difference? What made the difference was the touch of the master's hand. In other words, the violin was constructed to create beautiful music, but in the hands of a neophyte, it produces merely cacophony. So that evil is an emergent phenomenon. It was not pre-existing. It was not created by God to test us. So that's the second origin of evil, this emergent phenomenon because of how we as human beings process our experiences. The third source of evil, I believe, was what Carl Jung called the shadow. The fact that as individuals, we project our shadow material, which we don't recognize as being internal to us, we project it onto others. And when we do this as individuals, we have interpersonal conflict. When we do this as communities, we create prejudice. When we do this as nations, we create propaganda and war. And when we do this as a species, we actually create a malignant tumor on the etheric body of planet Earth. We create a global tulpa. And I gave the example of this great Pacific garbage patch in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, halfway between Asia and North America, where all of the rubbish which is dumped at sea off the east coast of Asia and the west coast of the United States comes together gyroscopically because of the tides and creates a garbage patch which is bigger than the size of Texas. That's what happens when we project our unrecognized shadow material onto the world. So that would be a third source of evil, I believe. The fourth source of evil, I believe, is what I would call service to self. That all of us land on a spectrum which begins at service to self and ends at service to others. Now, every little infant is born as a total narcissist and needs to be. A child needs to get warmth and cuddling and feeding and air. It has to be protected. So it has to start off at the service to self end of the spectrum. But with every thought, with every word, and with every action, we're moving along that spectrum backwards or forwards, back towards narcissism or forward toward compassion for others. So that's the source. Where do we land on that spectrum that creates evil in our times? The fifth source of evil, I believe, then, I'm going to call it off-world influences. And I gave the story about a very brilliant Russian astrophysicist who in 1964, a man called Nikolai Kardashev, looking at the universe and realizing that there are more, if you took all of the grains of sand on all of the beaches of the world and added to all the grains of sands on all the deserts of the world, there are more stars in the universe than are all of those grains of sand together. So there are literally trillions and trillions and trillions of planets out there. Moreover, parts of the universe are 3 times as old as planet Earth. Our solar system is only 4.6 billion years old. The universe is 13.8 billion years old. So there are parts of the universe which are 9 billion years older than planet Earth. So there are obviously civilizations out there much more advanced than we are. And he created what he called a typology, based on the technological sophistication of these civilizations. And he called a type 1 civilization would be a civilization where the inhabitants are able to mine, their entire planetary system for recyclable resources without depleting anything. A type 2 civilization would be able to do that for its entire solar system and all of the planets in our solar system. And a type 3 civilization, he believed, could do that for its entire galaxy. Now, I believe there may be actually a type 4, which is a civilization that could do that for the whole universe, and even a type 5, which could do that for the multiverses. Now, the question is, are any of these civilizations influencing behavior on planet Earth? And for instance, if there were a civilization which is much, much more technologically advanced and is exploring space and is based at the service to self end of the spectrum, we would simply be like ants as far as they're concerned. Are they influencing what's happening here? And that's why I chose the reading from Paul this morning, where he says very definitely, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers and the authorities, against the cosmic powers of the dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. So Paul is totally convinced that there are off-world influences, that's intervening here. That would be a fifth influence. A sixth one would be what I would just call genetics, that these spacesuits that we inhabit, which have evolved on planet Earth since life began on planet Earth 3.7 billion years ago, and life has been evolving. And so the very spacesuits we inhabit, the physical bodies we inhabit, are the result of that evolutionary trajectory. And at every stage, those beings who inhabited earlier versions of these kinds of spacesuits have been killers. There's been predators and preys. And we still carry within our brains, we carry the reptilian brain at the back, and we carry the mammalian brain at the center before ever the neocortex was developed. And so genetically, we're almost predisposed for warfare or for violence of various kinds. That would be number 6. Number 7 is karma. And I quipped, using Wordsworth, where he says, trailing clouds of glory do we come from God who is our home. I think that as well as that, trailing clouds of karma do we come. Now, karma is not all bad. We can create good karma. So all of that karma follows us. So we come into a world which has been influenced and in some senses contaminated by all the karma of all earth life which has preceded us, including previous incarnations of present life forms. And that energy swells into a force that creates sometimes violence at an internal level, intrapsychically, interpersonally, internationally, and even globally. And so that future generations are born into a world which is marinated in this kind of darkness. And that's my understanding of original sin. That would be number 7. And the final source of evil, I believe, is our loss of spirituality. And this is not just the secularization of the world. It is that, but not just that. It is that we have religions without mysticism, a spirituality that has descended into mere dogma. We have science without conscience, leading to life without meaning. We have a technology without ethics, leading to greed without compassion. So I would call that the loss of spirituality, the notion that God is dead. That would be the eighth, source of evil as far as I'm concerned. So that's all section 1, the sources of evil. What then are some of the consequences, of this reality? And I'm just going to focus on 2 pieces. There are lots of them, obviously. I'm going to focus on warfare and on slavery. So warfare, I'm going to divide into conquest, colonial regimes, and then internal conflicts. So there's not a tribe living anywhere on planet Earth which is not inhabiting land which has been taken by force from previous occupants. I don't care where you go in the world. There is no major culture which is not living on land which has been wrestled violently from previous inhabitants of the world. Even if you talk about Aboriginal peoples, they're not truly Aboriginal. There were people there before they arrived, or there were creatures there, whether you're talking about Neanderthals, or Homo floresiensis, or Denisovans, previous levels of hominids who existed before Homo sapiens sapiens took their terrain. And so we see, as we study world history, that just there's been one empire after the other conquering each other and occupying land that didn't belong to them. Beginning with the Akkadian Empire about 5,800 years ago in the Middle East, which was overthrown by the Assyrian Empire, which was overthrown in turn by the Babylonians, which was overthrown by the Persians. And then you had the Egyptians being overthrown by the Greeks, who were overthrown by the Romans. And then you had the Portuguese and the Spaniards and the British, and finally the United States of America, all conquering terrain all over the world. So every culture, when you really begin to look at it, has engaged in genocide, in civil wars, and in ethnic cleansing. As I said last Sunday, there are more than enough fingers to go around. Rather than pointing fingers at individual cultures or individual regimes, we need to realize that every culture has engaged in genocide and ethnic cleansing. You look at internal wars. Whenever the colonialist regimes have left, almost inevitably it's followed by civil wars where we begin to savage each other. So we had this in our country beginning in 1861. We had it in 1922 in Ireland when we finally kicked the British out. We had it in India in 1947 after independence, where Pakistan and India separated, and are still at war with each other, 2 nuclear powers. And we had it all over Africa in the 1960s. Most of the 54 countries of present-day Africa got their independence from colonialist regimes in the 1960s, and very, very quickly it led to civil wars internally. So you got civil wars again and again and again where people savaged their own. We had it in Europe in the 1400s with the Inquisitions, when people were literally torn limb from limb. We had it in the 15th and the 16th and the 17th and the 18th century in Europe, where Protestants and Catholics were at each other's throats. We had 2 world wars in Europe where over 100 million Europeans killed each other. In Africa, you had Idi Amin in his reign of terror, killing 300,000 of his own Ugandan people. We had in 1994, in a 100-day period between April and July of 1994, 900,000 Tutsi warrior people, men, women, and children, killed by other African Rwandans, the Hutu tribe. You have in Asia, in the reign of Mao Zedong, as he's trying to move from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy by force, creating a famine which killed somewhere between 15 million and 55 million Chinese people. And you had in Cambodia, 20% of the Cambodian people killed because of a famine, because of a changes by Pol Pot. And in the Americas, there's one example I gave, the Aztec culture sacrificed about 250,000 people every year in Mexico to the gods. And the way in which it was done was absolutely violent. The gods didn't like dead bodies. So they would pluck out the living heart of living people and pluck it out of the chest and offer it to the gods. And in 1487, during the dedication of a great temple, 80,400 people were slaughtered in 4 days to sacrifice to these gods. And so there's more than enough violence to go around internally and externally. We need to, when we look at world history, realize we've all been guilty. And stop just pointing fingers at particular regimes and say, they're the bad guys, we are the good guys. I looked at slavery in its previous forms, and I said that slavery is as old as life on planet Earth. There are plant life that creates slaves of other plants, like mistletoe with oak trees. They contribute nothing, and they suck the goodness out of the oak tree. They're total parasites. We have it in insect life, where they literally, some forms of ants, literally enslave other forms of ants and literally milk them for food, literally milk them. Matriarchal societies practice slavery. The Hebrew scriptures have over 1,000 references to slaves, except it's translated as servants. The New Testament has the word slave 150 times, except it too is translated into English as servants. In Athens, at the time of Aristotle, there are reckoned to be 80,000 slaves living in Athens alone. And in Rome, about 100 BCE, it's reckoned that 30% of the population were actually slaves. And then you look at slavery in our own country, and we point fingers at those in the South, the farmers who had slaves. But you have to realize that that's only the end product of a 5-stage system. All over the coast, particularly of West Africa, local chieftains were capturing other tribespeople and selling them to people who bought them. These transported them across the Atlantic. There were retailers at the other side who bought them, and then they sold them to the individual farmers. If you want to stop slavery, you have to realize there are 5 stages to the process. Without any one of these stages being in place, it couldn't have ended up in our own country. And so in the year 1803, the Dutch were the first group to outlaw transatlantic transport of slaves, followed by the UK in 1807 and the United States in 1808. And the local chieftains in Sierra Leone and down the west coast of Africa objected mightily that their trade was being interfered with. And there were wars fought, and the navies of Britain and America were stationed off the west coast of Africa, to deal with these slave ships. So we have to realize that slavery is a multi-pronged phenomenon. We all have to take responsibility for where we lie in that phase. Then I went on to look at modern forms of slavery. And I quoted last week, I led with a reading from chapter 47 of the book of Genesis, where there's Joseph, this man, who was the second most powerful person in Egypt after the Pharaoh, allegedly was protecting his people from famine. There was 7 years of famine after 7 years of great harvest. So he brought all the grains of Egypt and he stored them. And then the people came looking because they were hungry. And Joseph stripped them firstly, they had to pay for it. And when they had no money the second year, he told them, okay, you have no money left at this stage, so give me your livestock. And they had to cough up their livestock. The third year, they had to cough up their land. And the fourth year, they had to cough up their personhood and become slaves of Pharaoh. And the really upsetting part to me was that they were saying to Joseph, you are our savior. You've saved us. You've fed us. You've taken our money. You've taken our livestock. You've taken our bodies and you've taken our land. But we thank you for saving us. And I've seen this repeated again and again and again in world history, where the oligarchy either creates a situation, a crisis through false flag, or they take a naturally occurring crisis and they create, through the mass media, they create panic among people who are then begging for solutions. And the oligarchy comes in with the solutions, but say temporarily, we're going to have to suspend civil liberties and civil rights. And the temporary becomes permanent. So the price of being saved by the oligarchy from the crisis is the loss of civil liberties. I would say, in my opinion at this stage, that the greatest crisis America faces and the greatest crisis planet Earth faces is not the possibility of a nuclear holocaust, and it's not the possibility of climate degeneration. It is the censorship that's happening in our times, when it is not permissible to have an alternative perspective on any important issue. That people have been shut down by Facebook, by Amazon, by Apple, by Twitter, by Instagram, and that people who are being deplatformed, brilliant scientists, medical people of all stripes, who are not allowed a voice to contribute to the debate of how we need to solve the problems of our times. That was my second point, the results of evil. My third point then was that we can meet situations like this with simplistic analyses and with what I call pseudo-solutions. So to take, for instance, the idea of occupancy of land. This simplistic analysis and solution, that the way to resolve the problem of native peoples being subjugated, and they are being subjugated, is go back and send back. Go back to where you belonged and give back to the native people what belonged to them. What happens when you're a 4th generation American? One of your grandparents is from Nigeria, another is from Australia, a third is from Sweden, and a fourth is from Ireland. Where do you go back to? And if you do go back, what are you going to do? There are people living where you used to live, or where your grandparents or your great-grandparents used to live. And who owns the land when you first enter a land? Is it the first person to set foot in it? And does that person own the entire continent or just a square mile? When we finally get to Mars, and there are 3 spacecraft, as Americans, we just landed there last Thursday. The Chinese are about to land there, and the organization of the Emirates are about to land there. To whom does Mars belong? Are we going to carve up Mars belong to us? And subsequent arrivals, are they invaders? How do we decide who owns what? I made out the formula looking at planet Earth. It's a sphere, and there's a very simple formula to calculate the surface area of a sphere. It's 4 pi r squared. So I calculated the surface area of planet Earth, the dry land particularly, because it's just 30% of the globe. And I divided that among the 8 billion people on planet Earth right now, which means that every single one of us is entitled to 4.8 acres of planet Earth. Is that what we'll do? That we'll just divide the planet between 8 billion of us. So one guy gets 4.8 acres in downtown Manhattan, and the other guy gets 4.8 acres in the middle of the Gobi Desert. Is that justice? And what happens? Because within 3 or 4 generations, some people will have drunk and drugged their way out of what they inherited, and other people will have acquired. So we need much, much more, thought through solutions to the problems we face. There are huge problems. We're intelligent beings. We're spiritual beings, and we need to do it as spirit beings, addressing everybody involved in this phenomenon. And then finally, I looked at the notion of coming awake. And I looked at the notion of temptation, the dark side and the light side. The dark side seems to be that any beings who have free will, the more advanced they are technologically or intellectually, the greater their abilities and the greater the temptations. And all temptation ultimately is about the acquisition of power and control. And we see that, control over resources, control over people, and control over institutions. And we did an 18-month-long seminar in COGA in 2012 and 2013, looking at the effects of that on the political system, on religion, on the mass media, on finance, on education, on agriculture, on medicine, on the military-industrial complex. That's the dark side of temptation. But the light side of temptation is hugely important. Rumi said famously, "Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I will meet you there." It's the field in which the mystics live. Shakespeare said the same thing. There is nothing either good nor bad, but thinking makes it so. We are the ones who create the categories of light and dark, of evil and good, and then we inhabit those and we fight people whom we perceive to be on the other side. Whatever Satan is actually an invitation for us as human beings to grow spiritually. It's not an invitation to evil, it's an invitation to develop the faculty of discernment. What St. Ignatius of Loyola called de discretione spiritum, the ability to discern among spirits. All of the great avatars, Jesus, the Buddha, Mahatma Gandhi, they're all tested because in order to develop your aim as an archer, you have to get feedback from your previous attempts. And so without temptation, we would simply be robots pre-programmed to be good. There is no way we could evolve. So temptation, in fact, is an invitation to develop the faculty of discernment, which leads me to the conclusion that I've said to you many, 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 many times, that we volunteered to be here now. There is nobody on planet Earth here by mistake. We came as souls because we volunteered. This last Sunday, Nancy played this beautiful hymn from us. It's of Isaiah's vision in the temple in Jerusalem in 742 BCE, when he had a vision of God, and God said, "Whom will I send? I see the suffering of my people. Whom shall I send?" And I saying, "Here I am, Lord. It is I, Lord. I've heard you calling in the night. I will go, Lord, if you lead me. I will hold your people in my heart." Every single one of us sang that song to God. And then we parachuted into incarnation, and then we forgot. It is time now to bring on what I call the mysticists. That's a word I coined many, many, many years ago. Mysticists are a combination of mystics and scientists what Carl Jung would have called Gnostic intermediaries, people who are au fait with the scientific model and also deeply embedded in a mystical understanding of who we are and why we are here. That this is the invitation of our times. We are not here by mistake. We are not here because we took a wrong turn, at Planet Zord and took a right instead of a left. We volunteered to be here now. We said to God, send me, I'll go, because I hold your people in my heart. Okay, guys. So that was the synopsis. Let's open it up now to Q&A.
Yes, Seán, I'm a little puzzled by the story of, Adam and Eve in the garden and the forbidden fruit. I mean, can we assume that God is fairly intelligent and that God at least has the same intelligence that I would have as a parent or the average parent? Now, if I go to you for psychological counseling and I say my daughter is evil because I baked some cookies and I put them on the shelf and I said, I'm going out for a few hours, don't touch those cookies. And I came back and she had eaten one and I tell her, now you're evil. Well, it's not my daughter who's evil, it's me. I put the label on her. I created the category of good and evil. That's just the definition, artificial thing I set up. My daughter is curious. She has an appetite. As a parent, I should know that she was going to eat that forbidden cookie, right? So where did evil originate? Right. It didn't originate with Adam and Eve, did it?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I've used exactly that example you used of the cookies. I've used that precise example myself in previous homilies, Peter. So here's the deal here. The first thing, the realization, we have to discriminate between who God is and who we say God is. So you look at primitive people, desert nomads who are trying to make sense of their experience of life. They live in a world in which people die. They live in a world in which there is warfare. So they're trying to come up with, explanations to account for this. Women give birth to children in pain. Agriculture, gives us thorns as well as crops. They're trying to create stories that will explain all of these phenomena. And they come up with the story of the Garden of Eden. And of course, it's totally made up. This is not God. This is an understanding and a misperception of who God is. And of course, any God worth her salt is not going to create laws and put cookies in the way of little children and then expect them not to eat them. This is a fictitious story created by primitive people to try to make sense of the real world experiences they're having. And they're attributing to this, sky being the reason for it. And they come up with these stories. And every culture, every attempt to understand evil has created, simplistic analyses and pseudo-solutions to say this and this only is why, evil is here. Augustine came up with an equally ridiculous thing, that is orgasm that creates evil, because we're totally out of control and irrational. So all of these are simply attempts by previous generations and primitive peoples to make sense of real experiences. And of course, you're absolutely right. There is no way a loving parent would create a situation in which the child is destined to break a law and then be punished in perpetuity. You're absolutely right. And I've used the exact same example as you in previous homilies.
I would like to kind of continue that discussion where if these were the stories that, people came up with to explain God and evil, but now we look back and see how much was either like lost in translation and or deliberately mistranslated. Like when you talk about the word slave being mentioned 1,000 times in the Bible, being translated, like you said, it was so intentionally translated in every language into servant, where slave was completely removed or redacted from the Bible. So if that story is intended to create shame through like this notion of sin, that we're all conceived in sin, and slave was the original manuscript, like what are your thoughts that this text, this holy sacred text that we have learned so much from throughout the ages, how influenced or how manipulated or how originated was it by these these dark authorities that you mentioned, these off-planet forces that have infiltrated planet Earth to create a matrix of thought prison through shame about ourselves, our humanity, and our divinity. And so how do we reconcile that these sacred texts have been potentially compromised? And what does that mean in terms of our actual innocence, like, you know, the truth of our innocence?
So you've wrapped, great questions, Hannah. You've wrapped a whole bunch of stuff into it. You've wrapped the kind of notion of, you know, off-planet influences. You've wrapped the notion of sacred scriptures, the notion of interpretations and translations of that, institutions, and all of those are pertinent. And so obviously I won't have time to go into every one of them in detail, but just to say this to you, that we're looking at a species which is very, very young. Homo sapiens sapiens is less than 70,000 years old. Life on planet Earth is, you know, 3.7 billion years old. Life elsewhere in the universe may be 13 billion years of age. So we're a very, very young experiment. And in that course of time, we have made progress. There was evolution. But in that course of time as well, as we look back, we look at previous stages of evolution and we wonder, how in God's name could they ever have thought like that? You know, and there's some value to that as we continue to grow. But we also have to cut them some slack. If you look at, you know, an 8-month-old baby who's still not toilet trained and is pooping in his diaper, you can't blame him for pooping in his diaper. If you say, you know, here's a child who is 13 months old and is not able to speak fluently yet, and blame him for not doing that, it's, you know, it's not very reasonable to expect, you know, those kids to behave as adults. And in the same way, it is not actually reasonable to expect that in the 21st century that, you know, 5th century BCE human beings are going to operate in the same way that we do right now. So that's the first piece. We have to realize that there is an accumulation of human wisdom. There's an evolution of understanding of the world in which we find ourselves. So we got to cut them some slack. We got to build upon it. So that's the first piece I would say. The second piece I would say is that when you look at sacred scriptures of various kinds, whether you're talking about the Bhagavad Gita or the Pitakas of Buddhism or Celtic mythology or African folklore or the Judeo-Christian Bible, you have to realize that there are several different ways of interpreting and relating to it. And that is why Jesus Christ refused to speak in theological terminology or in scientific terminology. In Matthew's Gospel in chapter 13, he's accosted twice by his audience and accused of speaking in parables. And the first time he says, I speak in parables so that I may reveal things which have been hidden since the foundation of the world. Because you can't speak in theological terminology or in scientific parlance about the spirit world, the really, really deep stuff. The second time he said, I speak in parables so that seeing you may see, but not understand. Hearing you may hear, but not comprehend. Because if you're, you know, allowing the word of God to address you merely at an intellectual level, you are not going to get it. If it's not speaking to you at a heart level, and that means at a deeply mystical, symbolic level, then the stories that at the surface don't make any sense or maybe counter-scientific, at a much deeper level ring really, really true. So you have to be able to meet a truth at a level which is beyond the intellect, at the intuitive, mystical level. And then these stories, when they're interpreted in that fashion, begin to make a whole lot of sense. So it's not you have to discard the story as obviously ridiculous. You have to discard the interpretation of it and discard the fact that it was formulated by a people whose understanding may have been the original kind of literal interpretation. But now it's been offered to an audience, hopefully, which has evolved and is able to address these questions, you know, and accept these questions at a far deeper level. And that is the journey of our times. As human beings in the 21st century, drawing in all the great mystical traditions which have understood the interiority of the scriptures, to listen to those interpretations and to allow them to speak and to enliven and to activate the I am inside in every one of us, the God that you and I are. Because every single one of us is a fractal, a holographic fractal of source. Every single one of us is a spirit in a spacesuit, a soul on safari, a bite-sized piece of God who volunteered for human incarnation. So while we cut them slack, the institutions and the interpretations whatsoever, we have to go beyond that. And we can only go on beyond that by being beings of light ourselves and not getting hung up on the darkness that preceded us, but rather the light of which we were born.
My question, Seán, has to do with the eighth source of evil that you talked about, the loss of spirituality in religions without mysticism. It makes me wonder what the future of organized religion is. If what they are really, organized religions are famous for stamping out independent thinking and individuality. Yet there's an inherent kind of infrastructure there that draws people into community to fight that kind of alienation and sort of existential loneliness that people feel in order to. So it's got that just push going for it, but it's not delivering in the way that we might hope. And if we're actually, you know, as things are evolving and we're moving to this next stage, I'm wondering, is there a role it could play, or is it just needs to just fade away? Is it going to be that bastion of that you're constantly butting up against?
Okay.
So that's kind of where my thinking.
Great question, Karen. Great question. And so obviously, you know, when you look at all of the religions, not just Christianity or Catholicism, they tend to go through the same cycle again and again and again. You start off with some kind of a charismatic prophet, a Jesus figure or a Buddha figure. You know, the second stage is disciples gather around this very charismatic individual. The third stage is this charismatic individual typically is killed by some system, some oligarchy of other that feels threatened. The fourth one is that this group of, you know, disciples now create a community. The community morphs into an organization. The organization is taken over by some kind of a self-appointed oligarchy. The oligarchy insists on orthodoxy of belief. Then they create inquisitions against those within the system who don't believe, and crusades against those outside the system who don't believe. And then at some stage, it throws up a brand new prophet, you know, St. Francis of Assisi, and the cycle begins again. And this happens in all religions. Now, there is a purpose, there's a difference. I would consider myself at this stage Roman Catholic by family, but not Roman Catholic by a membership of an organization based in Rome, headed by an infallible Pope. I no longer have any obedience, you know, or affiliation with the Roman Catholic organization based in Rome. I have a tremendous respect for, and I'm a member of, a card-carrying member of the Roman Catholic, of the Catholic community, the universal community that follows Jesus Christ as a great God in flesh. And so I have to distinguish then between the difference between religion and community. Families, you know, communities coming together, drawn by a spiritual purpose. It's very important. Community is very important. We can't do it on our own. So there needs to be some level of community that does two things for us. It supports us in our search, and it challenges us in our beliefs. It has to do both. If it doesn't support us in our search, you know, then what's the point in being a member of a community? If it doesn't challenge us, then we're just becoming some kind of a cult, you know, obedient or group stepping to some perceived leader or other. So a community must challenge us and support us at the same time. It should give us great liturgy. It should ritualize it, because ritual in some senses is the enactment of our cosmologies, the enactment of our spiritual connection to God. Ritual is very, very important. So this is the importance of community. There will always be a need for community. Now, what is it going to look like into the future? Because inevitably, the larger, you know, a community grows, the more it institutionalizes itself, the more it becomes orthodox, the more it becomes unwilling to accept alternative perspectives, you know, and the more it clamps down and suppresses its members. So I believe that the future of religion is people who are dedicated to their own spirituality, forming little groups, maybe like COJ or others, who are, you know, networking with each other, but not creating some kind of a pan, you know, American conference, you know, of spiritual seekers, you know, all believing the same stuff. That'll be different groups composed of different people. Each individual, you know, completely dedicated to their own spiritual search and the realization of their own inner divinity, and therefore recognizing the inner divinity of everybody else. You know, coming together in different cultures with different experiences, contributing what those experiences have been, so that the body politic, the entire system, can benefit from the experiences of each individual and each community.
Father Seán, my question is, it comes from Matthew and Luke. They both kind of cover in the gospel Jesus saying he came to be a sword or division. He came not to bring peace, or not to assume. And then he goes on to say the division between father and son and family members. And I want to understand this more deeply. And I think the topic of the problem of evil that we've covered the past couple of weeks might be a good context. I'm wondering, because it's commonly accepted across religions and wisdom teachings that evil or the devil exists in this concept of separation, that is the delusion of oneness. And then how can we understand these gospels where Jesus is saying he came to divide things? Is there a deeper mystic meaning here? And is there any relation to this deeper meaning in the gospels to this topic that we've been covering the past couple of weeks?
So that's. I hope I've heard all your questions, Alison. You're breaking up quite a bit. Yes, there's a great statement in the Gospels where Jesus says, "Do not think I have come to bring peace on the world. I have come to bring the sword, to divide father against son, mother against daughter, mother-in-law against daughter-in-law, etc." Now, one of the things you have to realize is this, that I studied Proverbs as a little child. I was raised bilingually in Gaelic and in English. And I collected all the, I spent 3 months, one summer holidays, collecting all of the Proverbs in Irish and Gaelic. I collected 432 of them. Subsequently, I had the privilege of learning 6 different languages and bathing myself in the mythologies of Africa. And what I learned is that Proverbs constantly contradict each other, because truth is so multifaceted that there's a situation in which A is true and a situation in which A is not true. So for instance, with Proverbs, in Gaelic we say, there's no fireside like your own fireside. But we also say, there's a special taste on the neighbor's food. Both of those are true. In English we say, look before you leap, but we also say, he who hesitates is lost. They seem to contradict, they're both true. In Swahili we say, haraka haraka haina baraka. Hurry, hurry has no blessing. But we also say, chilewa, chilewa, mtoto siwako. Delay, delay, and the baby will not be yours. And so in every single culture that I've lived in and all the languages I've learned, Proverbs contradict each other because truth is multifaceted. So when you listen to Jesus saying, I have not come to bring peace to the world, but the sword, you have to realize this is one proverb for one kind of situation, and there are other proverbs that allegedly will contradict this, but are true in other situations. So having said that as a background, let me then unpack this one for you. Jesus Christ is not talking about bringing, sociological dissent within families or between friends. He's saying that if you, go on a spiritual journey and you're really serious about your spiritual journey, it would inevitably bring you into conflict even with people whom you love, because they will hold different positions and they are going to be outraged sometimes, and they're going to attempt to censor what you're thinking and what you're doing. And so, yes, it will inevitably lead to situations where families will be divided because some person is interested in a spiritual journey and honoring their own inner divinity, and somebody else is saying to you, no, you got to go to Mass on Sunday and you can't eat meat on Friday, otherwise you're going to go to hell. Or you can't marry a Protestant because you're going to go to hell. And so at some stage in every community and in every relationship, we are going to be tested. Am I primarily about my spiritual journey? Or am I primarily about not making waves and trying to fit into whatever system I find myself in? Because if I'm going to follow spirit, and if I'm going to be true to the inner promptings of God, inevitably, it's going to bring me into some kind of conflictual situations, even with people who love me and people whom I love. And the question is then, am I going to kowtow and bow down and say sorry? Another parable that Christ says, anybody who puts his hand to the plow and then looks back cannot be my disciple. In other words, if you start on the spiritual journey and then you have second thoughts about it, maybe I should do something different. Maybe I should go back to the safety of believing what the system tells me is the truth. Christ says, you can't be my disciple if that's what you do.
I have 2 questions. And the first one relates a little bit to what you've just been talking about. And it really has to do with the personal grappling. You know, I would say in the last 30 years of my life, I've had to, well, you know, in our encounters with others, when there are major differences and the challenges of trying to understand the mindset of another person. And I've found when these have been strong situations that what really makes the difference is the commitment to the relationship, because there needs to be a willingness to go there. And in a sense, I almost feel as if I've lost my question. I guess it's...
Let's deal with that question.
Okay.
Let's deal with that question first.
Yeah, because it's the difficulty. In other words, how much will we accomplish in the world if it takes a couple of years or if it's many years to deal with just one person?
Okay. So I love your statement that it's important to be committed to the relationship, that no matter what the difficulties are, it's important to be committed to the relationship. I would say it's important to be committed to two relationships, primarily the relationship with God, and secondarily, my relationship to the important person in my life or the important institution in my life. And if it comes down to a choice that's forced upon me, that I have to choose one or the other, I have to choose God. Even if I need to relinquish a relationship in order to be true to my relationship with God, I need to be true to my relationship with God. But if that doesn't call for that, you know, then I have to put the relationship with the other person, you know, make it really, really important. When I say that, in order to kind of commit to a relationship, there have to be a few ground rules. And the first and most important ground rule, and this is what I do with all of my clients in psychological counseling, particularly when I'm working with couples, you have to let the other person have a viewpoint and a perspective. You have to listen to it. You have to understand it. You have to be able to articulate their viewpoint as eloquently as you articulate your own before you can articulate your own viewpoint. And so commitment to the relationship means really learning to listen. And you can't listen if there's censorship. If one party in a relationship refuses to hear the other party's viewpoint, there isn't a relationship. If one member of a family, the daddy of the family or whatever, you know, forces his opinion on everybody else and nobody else is allowed to have an opinion, you don't have a family. So commitment to the relationship is primarily about there being no censorship of perspectives, real listening, the ability to feed back what you've heard and then to offer an alternative perspective so that there's thesis, antithesis, synthesis. But primarily, you're here as a child of God. And if you have to forego earthly relationships in order to maintain that, then you have to do it.
The other one, I guess, is really for a comment. Last night, CNN aired an interview with Bill Gates that was done by Anderson Cooper. And it was about his new book that's on climate change and how we need to deal with the rather drastic things that will happen. And in one of his comments, Gates said that, well, you know, people will end up moving away from the equatorial areas of the world. And, you know, then that in itself will cause a lot of conflict and civil wars. And, you know, I don't know, maybe I'm too naive or whatever, but, you know, I just felt such a sense of distress that I guess that the idea of, okay, this war business will just keep going and going and going.
Okay. Let me just respond to that. I'm not obviously, we don't have the bandwidth here to get into individual kind of discussions of stuff like climate change or whatever. But I will say this, that it is very important that you, Teresa, and I, and everybody listening, that we have access to all of the opinions on all of the important issues. And as long as there's censorship in our country, and the likes of Bill Gates have total access to all of the media outlets, and people like Robert Kennedy Jr. are being deplatformed so that their opinion doesn't matter. We're not going to have intelligent discussions about climate change or any other topic. So if you're not concerned about censorship, you know, anybody who's not concerned about censorship in our country right now is asleep at the wheel. Educate yourself, look at the other perspectives, all these issues.
Okay.
And that's just exactly what I was going to talk about. Is I just listened to the link that Michael Chow sent me on Robert Kennedy and such.
Right.
And I'm wondering if it's the normal amount of people dying in the United States is the same as the ones that they're telling us is happening, because they don't keep track and let us know what is the normal amount of people dying in the United States yearly, normally.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mary Kate. So again, I'm not going to get into individual kind of issues because we don't have the time for that. But what I am saying is I'm happy that you're looking at alternative perspectives. There are brilliant scientists, there are great, medical people, there are extraordinary attorneys, there are fabulous, biochemists who are looking into all of these issues.
Yes.
But they're not being allowed, they're debating these issues and they're making videos, but the videos are being taken down. So unless we deal with the issue of censorship in our country, there is no way we can come to intelligent solutions about any of the grave issues facing us as a world population right now. So whatever you need to do to kind of roll back this censorship, that's what you need to be concerned about.
Right. And the other question is, you were talking about one country is attacking another country, and when that stops, then a civil war starts. And when that stops, another country attack. Is there any way that cycle can be broken?
There is a way. Again, I said to you, Mary Kate, we're a very young species. We're 70,000 years old in a universe which is 13.8 billion years of age. It's a very young experiment. It was only literally about 2,500 years ago that the great avatars started to come among us. The Buddha, Mahavira in India, Lao Tzu and Kung Fu Tzu in China, Zoroaster in Persia, Isaiah and Jeremiah in Israel, Socrates, Plato and Aristotle, in Greece. So only in the last 2,500 years have the great avatars becoming among us. We're still very, very young at this. But you and I and everybody here have volunteered to be on planet Earth right now. And we volunteered, we said to God, send me, I'm going to go. I will hold your people in my heart. So there are two ways of, wrestling with this issue right now. Some of it is being in the trenches, working in the trenches, looking at the notion of censorship or whatever. And the other thing is our spirituality and our community, that we are creating a mindset, a vibratory rate, an energy which is light-filled, which is a way, way above the vibration at which warfare, and slavery operate. So we have to create an alternative level of reality, which is so, seductive and appealing that even those who are committed to darkness right now will begin to see the light. So it's meditation, time spent in nature, looking at little children, how they play, looking at animals as they interact with each other. The whole notion, at the very end of today's session, I've chosen a little video, 4-minute video that was sent to me by a friend of mine, Monica Dunn, looking at little children's notion of who these light beings are that surround the planet and their understanding of, of our relationship with them. So yes, there are things we need to do in the trenches and away beyond the trenches. It's like you're painting a mural on a wall. You have to go into the wall to paint the details, but then you got to stand back and appreciate the entirety and make sure that the details are fitting into what you have in mind. So you have to withdraw from the world in order to create, a perspective, and then come into the world in order to make a difference. Both end.
Well, this is such a profound topic, and I've really been thinking about evil and sin and consciousness. And I think one of the most profound books that I've ever been introduced to was David Hawking's Power versus Force.
Right.
And he calibrated this map of consciousness. And anything under 200 is a victim abuser mentality. And the lowest vibration is shame. And then there's guilt and fear and anger. As you go higher into your frequency of your consciousness, you hit 200, which is courage, where you actually have the ability to be your more authentic self. So I've been looking at this kind of thing about the master-slave model, which I think we all, coming to this planet, this one was considered a slave planet, with some of the manipulation by outsiders. So to get beyond this slave mentality, the control within myself, my own self-control can be so uncontrollable because I want to have my hedonistic self wants to be happy for today, gratification for today. But the discipline and the courage to be able to change yourself, that's profound soul work.
Yes.
Really, because when we change ourselves, he says, as we raise our consciousness and we get to 200 and beyond, up to 1,000, which is Christ consciousness, we change the morphogenic field.
Absolutely.
So every time we're working on ourselves with self-love, self-compassion, forgiveness, but courage to really look at where am I controlling myself as an abuser, as a victim, and as a controller, master. So I'm so fascinated about this. What do you think about his work?
I love, it's a pity he's dead now. He was a great, I actually saw him speak at a conference one time. Brilliant, a synthesis and analysis of the vibratory stages of consciousness expansion. I love what he's done. And I totally agree with you. There have to be practical ways in which we do this. And so over the last several weeks, I've, talked about 5 different practices that I'm trying to kind of work with myself. And that is, replacing fear with love, replacing anxiety with trust, replacing anger with compassion, replacing judgment, with wisdom, and replacing revenge with forgiveness. So in very practical ways, we have to set ourselves tasks and say, whenever, I find myself slipping into the fear or the anxiety, or the judgment mode, I have to flip out of that and create a different, vibratory rate. Because I agree with you, human thought constellates and creates either dark, tulpas, which are, cancerous to the whole planet, or we create Christ consciousness, which heals the entire system. But we do that through practices in very practical fashions, like catching every thought, catching every word, catching every action, say, is this coming out of fear or anxiety or anger or unforgiveness, what is, and then changing it over. Thanks, Ingrid.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think these experiences have come up as a result of hearing your homilies the last 3 weeks. Because I was watching a program with Henry Louis Gates Jr. He does on people's history, their DNA and where they come from and their great grandparents and all this. And then my brother was sending me articles about my Southern relatives, and they were big in the Confederate Army, generals and all this kind of thing. And then I read an article about them, one of them holding 7 slaves. And I thought, oh my God, I knew this was coming, and you think, oh my Lord, my relatives had slaves. And I just can't come to grips. I can't be responsible for them and for the darkness of their past and how they came to be part of that. But what I guess I'm concerned about is we have a group that still haven't gotten over the Civil War, like the anti-Semitics, the poor boys, the neo-Nazis, the white nationalists, oath keepers, and those groups. I mean, we work on ourselves, but what do we do when we have that kind of cancerous situation going on in parts of our country? How do we handle that?
A very important consideration, firstly, and I've said this last week, I believe, is I think unless we build a theory of reincarnation into our cosmologies, we're losing a hugely important piece of the puzzle and a piece of the solution. I am totally convinced that every single one of us has been in very many different configurations, ethnically, racially, gender-wise, socioeconomic status-wise, IQ level wise. And so we have tested ourselves against various configurations of the human condition in order to learn how to love in all circumstances. And so it's very important that we not get stuck in the prejudices of the particular configuration in which I find myself, in 2021. I have to realize that I have been in the other positions. I may have been a slave owner in a previous lifetime. I may have been a slave in a previous lifetime. And so as we try to pool the resources of our experiences over many, many lifetimes, we have to rise above the individual conflicts. And by moving into light ourselves and moving into light as groups, we change the dynamic in such a way that there's no place left for the darkness to feed. We're not going to demolish it immediately by counteracting it or denying it its voice. If they have an opinion, they're entitled to an opinion. We may disagree with it, but we can't disagree with the fact that they're entitled to have their perception of their reality. And the best way of changing an enemy is to turn the enemy into a friend, to treat them with love and respect and understanding, and melt the prejudice and the fear that's creating their particular models. But we ourselves as individuals and as communities, we suffer from some of the same darkness. So we need to make sure, that we're cleaning our own house. When Christ says, physician, heal thyself. If I'm not healing myself, I don't have the right to begin healing anybody else.
Back in 2012, we created our exploration groups so that we could look into some of these topics and hold each other with love in a way that we could explore these in a safe way. And now with the media and our sources of information being cut off, it seems like some sort of group like this might be needed again. I'm just wondering if you have any ideas about how we can help each other through the times that we're in.
Okay. Thanks, Michael. It's a great question. And obviously the ways in which we help each other is firstly by our own individual commitment to fact-finding, to really examining the evidence, to listening to both perspectives on all the important issues and educating ourselves before we have the right to begin challenging another person's perspective. If I don't know, I haven't listened to and haven't access to the data, then what is the evidence I can adduce to support my viewpoint? So firstly is self-education. Secondly, it is raising my consciousness so that any dialogue takes place in an atmosphere of love, forgiveness, and listening. And then thirdly is literally using the technology available to us. There are many geniuses in our world right now who are committed to creating alternative platforms for people with alternative perspectives to be able to reach the audiences who are interested in it. And so we have to support those who are in favor of freedom of speech. We have to support those on a practical level. And then maybe, as you say, if there's an interest in the community, some way, either through Zoom services or whatever, that we can create some kind of a dialogue in which people who are educated in the issues, and you don't have to have a PhD in order to be educated about the current issues, but you have an intelligence and you need to have access to the data. People who are committed to accessing the data on both sides and then dialoguing, then we can create some kind of a movement to push this forward.
I really liked the Rumi quote. I really like the talk about polarities. I think it's really important. I really like when you talked about letting other people having a viewpoint. I think we should go back and make sure that we're listening to each other's viewpoints. I like when you said, can you articulate my viewpoint? I think that's really important. I also liked when you talked about projecting your shadow onto others and narcissism and accountability. I almost feel like that is a crucial question, having a discussion of dialogues and then saying, can you articulate my viewpoint as a way to see if people are listening? Anyway, I guess my question is just about the censorship. What do you think we can do about that? I didn't even know that was happening, that there's good people that can't actually present their work on certain platforms. I actually wasn't even aware of that. So I'm just curious what you think we can do about that censorship. And also, there is a new app that I discovered recently that is pretty magnificent. It's called Clubhouse, and it is audio only. So it's very inclusive. There's a huge percentage of people of color on there, and it's basically based on what people say. So you can kind of quickly see you can hear if they're an expert or if there's depth to what they're saying. So it's a pretty cool app. But if you can talk about the censorship thing and what can we do about that?
Okay, so you're raising two topics that are very important. One is kind of the dialogue and the other is the censorship. So I put you very, very simply, you take any topic you're interested in and do a Google search or a Wikipedia search on it and try to find speakers with an alternative perspective, and you find you can't find them anymore. So if you don't know how to go around the system, you're not even aware that there is censorship because the mass media are not telling you about it. And so you're completely in the dark. You're assuming that what the mass media are telling you is the truth, the one truth and the only truth, and it's backed on science. And very often it's not. It's a particular perspective, and there are some scientists who believe in it, and there are a lot of other scientists and doctors who take precisely the opposite perspective, but you can't find them anymore. So you need to be able to access ways of dealing with the extraordinary people like Robert Kennedy Jr., who's been fighting for 30 years for children's rights and has been deplatformed by Facebook and Instagram. And you can't find this stuff unless you know how to go around it. And so topics you're really interested in, you try to search for them on mainstream search engines, and they're either not available or they're going to treat it as pseudoscience or made up stuff. So that's in response to censorship. You need to find alternative means. Now, one suggestion is if people are really interested in looking at alternative perspectives on modern issues, there's ways of getting around it. If any of you want to kind of have access to these, I'm more than happy to supply that in emails or Michael Choi's to people who are really interested in finding both sides of any important question to you right now. And you can educate yourself and then decide for yourself what you choose to believe. So that's the second part, the first part of your question, and I'll end with this one. In my psychology practice, many, many, many years ago, I created a one-page sheet that I gave to all couples whom I was counseling. And I called it the 10 laws of good communication. And it's laws I'd culled from years and years and years of doing therapy with couples. And the first 4, I actually borrowed from Native American Indian powwows. If you ever go to a powwow, there are 4 rules to a powwow. The first one is show up, pay attention, speak your truth without shaming the other person, and do not be attached to an outcome. They're the 4 rules of powwow. You show up, you pay attention, you don't shame the other person, and you're not attached to your own viewpoint. You're willing to learn. Now I want to focus just on the second one, because I went into great detail with couples in explaining this to them. What does paying attention mean? And I've seen this repeated again and again and again in counseling situations. The first thing is, I'd watch where a couple sat when they came into my room. I had a couch, which could seat 3 people, and then 1 individual armchair. And as they came in, if I was meeting them for the first time, I watched where they sat. And if one guy sat on the couch and the other sat in the armchair, I knew immediately there was problems here. They were separating themselves literally physiologically, and that told me immediately. If they sat on the couch and one person, and they're turned away from each other, the person on the right turned to the right and the person on the left turned to the left, so they're not making eye contact, I know there's a bad communication going on here. If when one person began to speak, the other person said, I don't want to hear that, I don't want to hear that. That's not listening, obviously. If the other person objected as soon as the partner began speaking, that is not listening. Interrupting is not listening. If you finish everything you need to say and then I respond only to the parts I disagree with, that is not listening. Listening is, I turn my body to you. My heart is open. I'm not defended like this. My eyes are not angry. Buddhism talks about soft gaze and harsh gaze. Soft gaze is where I embrace you with my eyes. Harsh gaze is where I attack you with my eyes. So I'm sitting on the same couch. I'm facing you. I'm not defended. My eyes are soft. I'm listening to you. I don't interrupt you. I don't put my hands over my ears. And when you're finished speaking, I respond to everything you've said. I articulate to the best of my ability what I think I heard you saying. And then I say to you, did I get it right? And you say, yeah, you heard what I said. Then, and only then, can I give my own perspective. So that is what needs to happen in any community, in any dialogue, and in any world situation. And it is not happening now. They're not listening. Not only that, they're not allowing one party into the room. It's like you're trying to do couples counseling with only one person in the room. And you're getting a report, here's what my wife did or my husband did. Why isn't she here? I don't want her here. How can you expect to reconcile a relationship if there's only one party in the counseling room? Namaste.